5 years ago, I worked as a CNA at an Eastern Tennessee nursing home. Not for me. I had a resident named Helen, who upon getting my hall assignment, was told by my hall partner that they all believed her to be possessed. Ha, right, whatever. First off, I'm not religious. Second of all, I've seen too many elderly folks acting crazy by the grace of Father Time. That's the Bible Belt for you. So I just smiled and nodded, because why be rude? Helen turned out to be one of the more difficult residents, to say the least. She was wheelchair-bound and could scoot herself up and down the hall, muttering to herself, and sometimes, without warning, she would attack someone close to her, be it a fellow resident, staff, or visitor, clawing, hitting, and kicking, until she was pulled off the bewildered person. She did have incredible strength when these attacks happened, and she would growl these deep, guttural growls the whole time. We ended up having to keep her isolated in a room alone, with her wheelchair locked to keep the other residents safe. A few months into the job, I switched to night shift on the same hall, because the shift differential was a little over $1 more on the hour. I was told by the night shift nurse that Helen was just as much a handful at night as she was during the day. One night, while I was walking down the hall to do my midnight vitals, I smelled the familiar stench of fecal matter when I stopped by Helen's room. I thought maybe evening shift left a dirty adult diaper in the trash can, as they sometimes do it if they're in a rush to get through their end-of-shift dry routine. The trash cans are right by the inside of the doors, so that the housekeepers can easily reach in and empty them. I stuck my head in the room, and by the light from the hall I could see the trash can was empty, but the stench was unmistakable and very strong. I stepped into the room and paused. I could hear Helen's raspy, low muttering. It creeped me out more than usual because on night shift there was only one CNA per hall. I was alone. The nurse was at the nurse's station. It was dark in there, and Helen was awake. Her bathroom was to the left of her door, so I reached in and turned the light on. I was horrified at what I saw when I stepped past the bathroom and came in view of Helen's bed. She lay there on her backside facing me with her bony hand. She was wiping her own feces on the wall, but there was red mixed with the brown. After calling the nurse, the two of us discovered she hadn't just played in the bowel movement she made in her adult diaper. She had dug it out of herself, ripping the thin, delicate anal tissue in the process, wiping the poop, bloody mixture all over the wall. She never made out like she felt any of it. We had to start restraining her through the night. Another night, a new charge nurse had gotten assigned to my hall. In the mornings before day shift started, the nurse had to give all morning meds. I warned her not to interact with Helen unless I was with her. "That little bitty old thing?" she asked. "She can't be more than 85 pounds soaking wet." 87.5, I said. "And it takes 5 CNAs to bathe her." She looked at me like she didn't believe me, but agreed to let me know before she medicated her. Right before I started my end-of-shift charting, the nurse told me she was ready to administer Helen's meds. I nodded, stood up, and followed her into Helen's room, where she still lay restrained. I went to get a pair of gloves from the dispenser, but they were empty. I turned to the nurse and said, "I'll run to the stockroom for a box of gloves. Don't touch her until I return." I saw the nurse's eyes roll as I exited the room. Coming back from the stockroom, I heard cries of help ringing down my hall. The CNA from the adjacent hall was already running towards the sound, and I followed. The source was the ever-doubting newbie nurse who had undone the wrist straps of the sweet old lady and was now being clawed at. She had a hand full of her hair from the back of her head and was digging her fingers into her throat, which were all scratched up and starting to bleed. Helen was screaming in a guttural rasp, "We hate you." It took me, the other CNA, and another nurse to pry Helen's fingers off my nurse and restrain her again. The nurse from the other hall was cleaning my nurse's wounds while I took down the incident report. She said through sobs that after I left, Helen spoke to her in a sweet voice, told her good morning and smiled at her. She asked if she wouldn't mind helping her go to the bathroom. Helen was incontinent and hadn't used a toilet in over a year. The nurse told her that of course she would and removed the wrist restraints, when Helen suddenly pounced. She cried harder, saying her voice, even the smell of her, completely changed. I charted the nurse had deep lacerations to her throat and was missing a patch of hair. Helen had ripped it from her skull. She quit that night. There were many other instances, and I became terrified of caring for that woman. The worst happened on my last night working at the nursing home. I was about to leave. I had already clocked out, but remembered I needed to tell the day shift CNAs about a resident having an out-of-facility doctor appointment, that one of them would need to have to ride with them. I spotted them down the hall and called out to them walking in their direction. I was passing Helen's room, did a double take and stopped dead in my tracks. Day shift had already gotten Helen up and in her wheelchair. It was in locked position in the middle of her room, but she'd somehow had gotten one of her hands free from the restraint and was chewing the index finger of said hand. It was all a blur. I screamed something. I ran into the room, and the day shifter nurse ran with me. It took all of us to wrestle her finger out of her mouth. She was screaming in protest and growling the whole time, mouth of yellow and jagged teeth covered in blood and bits of flesh. Helen had chewed the meat off most of her right index finger. The doctor was called in, and he said he'd never seen anything like it, and she would need skin graft surgery. It was more than I could take. I walked out of the nursing home and never returned. I didn't give any notice either. I didn't even call. I remained traumatized by Helen and never worked as a CNA again.